A 90-year-old veteran refuses to back down against a bunch of rowdy motorcyclists. But the twist. A phone call transforms everything. Will leave you wanting to see more. Tales of bravery and tenacity struck sign up now to see Mildred Washington's name, that dwelt with the whispers of history. In the center of Topeka, on a peaceful street, her humble Kansas home was a tiny white home, encircled by faded shutters. A garden she lovingly cared for every day. Mildred, who was 90 years old, had earned the right to live in peace despite her. The past mentioned anything but calm. She was an experienced member of the few women of color have previously served during World War I as a nurse. Despite being rich in history, her stories were seldom spoken outside of her close-knit neighborhood, and friendships in this small community moved with a soft, mornings at pace, started with the sound of bicycle-riding kids and birds chirping among the maples that bordered Mildred's mornings on the street were her. She would sit on her front porch as a sanctuary, drinking a hot cup of tea while observing she watches the world change around her. But one Tuesday, everything in the afternoon with a deep guttural roar that interrupted the serene. The sound originated from a row of motorbikes thundering along the road, disturbing Mildred's tranquility. The bikers were young, boisterous, and their presence, clad in black leather, quite different from the peaceful street. They came to a sudden halt close to her residence, putting their bicycles on the lawn, and before, the sidewalk engines sputtered, dying, and there was a pause before the laughs began. Loud jeering and purposefully loud enough to be heard by Mildred. She observed them with her hands from her porch. The leader folded nicely in her lap, a tall man wearing a red bandana. When he saw her eyes, he grinned and pushed against his friend's gaze at the grandmother there. Bet has anecdotes about dinosaurs, spoke in a tone brimming with. The group burst into jeering. Mildred laughed without flinching from her gloomy. Despite her advanced age, her brown eyes remained piercing. With silent determination, she studied them, didn't answer, but instead rose slowly. G tore the armrest off of her chair for assistance and entered her home. She gently shut the door behind her. This was interpreted by bikers as an invitation to intensify their antics, with music blaring from one of them was attached to a speaker. His motorcycle stands in stark contrast to the tranquil buzz of they laughed and yelled in the neighborhood. Their voices resonating throughout the street, upsetting the neighbors who peeked cautiously from behind drapes, but refused to step. In for M, not only was this noise, but it was a challenge that she had encountered more loudly and more fearsome foes in her lifelong recollections of war, and she faced discrimination because she was a black lady. In the military had made her more resilient. She wasn't readily influenced. Later that night, Mildred entered her porch once again this time. She swept the wooden boards with a brush, as even if the boisterous music and laughter were nothing but a bothersome breeze, that when bikers saw her again, they turned, returning their focus to Grandma. "Please don't injure yourself," with one of them yelled, earning at that broom. Mildred, more laughs from the group, did not respond, but instead paused her sweeping and gave them a clear view. Unwavering, steady look, and for a minute, the laughing. She hesitated and went back inside without a word. However, Mildred understood that quiet wasn't. These males were pushing boundaries sufficiently, and she sensed the tension building. She took a look at the vintage rotary phone in her fingers, grazing the kitchen awesome surface. Years had passed since she had called the number that she was currently. As she sat at her table, thinking about a tattered portrait dangling in the air caught their attention. She was standing tall on the wall in her army outfit, with her other soldiers around her whose allegiance had been established. She released a calm, measured fire of war. Mildred wasn't going to allow her to breathe. Peaceful existence to be disturbed by a bunch of young men who believed their cacophony could scare her, because she was fully aware of what she to be completed. But the time had to be. The riders came back the following day. They were louder this time, brasher, and their engines roared, much more annoying, as they arrived at Mildred's house. House once more purposefully revving to cause as much disturbance as you can. Their neighbors looked through their curtains, yet was hesitant to leave their uncomfortable. This was not your typical. These men are causing a nuisance in the neighborhood. Appeared intent on demonstrating their ownership. Mildred was sitting on her porch in the street. once more with her, hands in her lap. Serene manner stood in sharp contrast to the mayhem taking place before her. The one wearing the red bandana is the leader. Strolled towards her picket fence. He heard his boots crunching on the gravel, smugly grinning carelessly against the barrier extending throughout his face. He called out, "Granny, don't you? Consider switching to a nursing program. This street is too lively for home. Someone like you caused the group to erupt," laughing and giving each other backpats as though they told the joke of the Mildred didn't reply, so she stayed. Sat, staring at the leader with a low level of intensity that appeared to unnerve him, even if he refused to acknowledge it. The abuse wasn't limited to words. They started hurling empty beer cans at her, Lon giggling while they observed her. Picking, she took them one by one without complaint, carefully arranging the cans into a garbage bag before going back to her seat. But she was. Every insult and jeer was calculated, listed in her. Remember, these youngsters didn't know who they were interacting. By the third day, the antics of the biker had become increasingly bolder. They established a playing in a makeshift camp on the sidewalk, playing loud music and acting as though they were private. Playground. The once immaculate lawn of Mildred was now covered in trash, and the leader's tauntings were continuous. Got louder, his voice filled with, "Perhaps you don't mind the condescension," he yelled over the music. "Mashu!" I assumed an elderly woman like you wouldn't care, most likely lacks the ability to see clearly. No longer one of the younger motorcyclists hesitated, his eyes darting to Gentle with a hint of discomfort. "Perhaps we're overstepping our bounds," whispered, but the commander dismissed him with a wave. "What will she do? Call the police?" "They won't bother with some, please." Mildred didn't call the harmless fun. She was more knowledgeable than anyone about police. Some conflicts called for a more calculated approach. She wasn't scared. Instead, she, waiting like the sun that night, sank beneath the bikers and Horizon's Mildred, laughing, reverberated down the street, entered her porch with a resolute. She held her antique rotary phone with an attitude, and a notebook in the other hand. Its pages are crammed with numbers and names she hadn't examined in decades, and her fingers shook a little. Not because of fear, but rather because of the weight of what she was going to. Did she call a number she hadn't previously called? In more than 40. The phone rang once, twice, and 3 years ago, before someone's voice responded on the other. Finally, "Mildred, is that your voice?" Was heated and rough, with a mixture of "I'm Arthur," and "I'm surprised," and respected. "I need a favor," she said in a firm voice. Her younger brother, Arthur Washington, and a former Army Ranger paid attention. Carefully as she described the circumstances, Mildred could interrupt, but he didn't. Hear the strain in his side. Eventually, Arthur said, "Silence, no more." Mildred hung up and said, "I'll take care of it," and went back to her porch chair. The bikers couldn't read her expression, were continued giggling without realizing the storm that is developing just out of the time. They became aware of what was about to happen. It would be too late in the morning, contained the subtle aroma of rain. But the Mildred, the sky stayed obstinately clear, waited outside her kitchen window, observing the once again bikers come together to laugh. Despite her nerves, she didn't allow it displays her hands and face remaining composed. While making a pot of tea, steady was the day that everything would be different. Arthur had assured her that he would take care of it. But Mildred didn't think leaving was a good idea. Everything is in the hands of someone else. She had fought conflicts all her life. Some on the battlefield, while others in opposition to the silent prejudice that accompanied her home. This wouldn't be. As she took a drink of her tea, she looked at her husband's picture. Charles is seated on the counter with pride. He had been absent for more than 20 years, but his words never stopped echoing in her head. "Mildred, let them see. You perspire even when they're attempting to shatter the clattering sound of a beer can." She smashed her rye against her porch, the cup, and proceeded to the door. The leader returned, beaming like a fox in a hen. "You don't give up, do you, House?" sneered. Most would have pleaded with us to Mildred opened the door by now, but didn't go outdoors. She gazed at him, face to face, and with the same, she soothed soldiers in a soothing tone, in the field advised you to have fun. As it her final words hung in midair, cutting by means of the laughing, the leader paused, his smile wavering for a moment. Just before he recovered, you received a, "I'll give you that, grandmother," sense of humor. His attention returned to his crew, but no one else was laughing this time. With a calm heart, Mildred shut the door. She picked up the phone with a CIC, clear head. Dialing a second number again, this one was for Martha, not for Arthur. Jenkins, a former member of her unit's left wing and among the most ingenious females. As far as Mildred was aware, Martha was retired and currently residing a few towns away. However, her devotion was, when she said, unwavering, Mildred Martha detected the warmth in her voice. "What's going on? It's been too long." Mildred described everything in detail. Criticize each and every waste item that is put on her lawn each time Martha listened intently while she laughed. And when Mildred was done, there was a Martha paused well before speaking, and her tone abruptly, firm. "You are aware that I don't sit by and do nothing. Some of my contacts would be delighted to visit those boys." Mildred gave herself a tiny, "I knew you would say," smile. Later that afternoon, as the motorcyclists Mildred proceeded to sit on their racket, her porch in a calm manner. In anticipation, she observed the younger, once more. The biker who appeared uneasy with the behavior of the group. He was seated independently of the others. Eyes lingering, Mildred thought for a second about her, talking to him, but she chose not to. Despite its weakness, his moral compass wasn't her duty to. She had a larger guide. Planned, the sun dragged on for hours, casting behind the line of houses across the street long shadows. There were no traces of bikers departing, but it didn't concern Mildred. When the first pair of headlights emerged at the conclusion of the street, her mouth formed a faint grin as two SUVs slowly rolled in, engine humming with authority that the motorcyclists were unaware of, initially too engrossed in their song, and Mildred sat back in her chair and laughed. Gently tucking her hands in her using lap, time to impart knowledge to these lads, she whispered to herself. What would transpire next would turn, altering the tables in unexpected ways. The first SUV stopped right away. The house across the street. From Mildred's, the second its engine rumbled to a stop, pushed in the doors directly behind it, opened simultaneously. As four men emerged, their moves thoughtful and serene, exuding a sense of they were older, and each wore an authoritative black jackets with an embroidered insignia, a crest on the chest that represented Arthur and their tenure as Army Rangers. Stepped out from behind the wheel of the original SUV's massive physique and silver. His stubbly beard gives him a dominant. He was not in a uniform when he was there, but his posture alone conveyed a lot of information. Three of his closest buddies were standing next to him. All former military personnel from his regiment, taught to deal with circumstances precisely. The bikers paused in mid-laugh like this, their heads shifting in the direction of the new arrivals. The leader continues to tilt against his back was straightened by Mildred's fence. His arrogant smile wavered as he assessed the men walked up to Arthur, and their eyes met. Onto him, and his eyes' weight was sufficient to remove the sneer from the face of the leader. You must be the only one who has been, Arthur said. His voice was disturbing. My sister. Calm but steely edge to his speech. Silence lacked the weight that words did. Appeared to, sister, amplify, the leader repeated, uncomfortably looking at Mildred, who was now seeing the action with we were just hanging out, with a slight smile. Arthur stepped out and brought his hands closer, idly lying at his sides, although this was not a casual hanging presence. He flatly reaffirmed his tone by trash throwing on her lawn while blaring, constantly playing music that makes fun of a woman who's accomplished more for this nation than you might ever imagine. If the crew leader moved uncomfortably, their bluster dissipating beneath the examination of Arthur, and one of the bikers in the team mumbled something, but the commander dismissed him with a wave, attempting to preserve some semblance of authority. Look, we had no intention of hurting the leader, stated in a defensively laced voice. It was only a few. Arthur had fun and didn't hurt his eye. Get in touch, and I'll show you how much fun it looks. I find that respecting others is enjoyable. Fun is knowing when to have fun. Who has earned it? Avoid taking on more than you can handle. You are able to. Nonetheless, there was a noticeable sense of tension in the air. And the motorcyclists had stopped. The younger motorcyclist who was laughing had appeared uneasy right away, took a move. Away, separating himself from the gathering, his gaze quickly shifted to Mildred. An expression of remorse flickered across his face. Prior to the leader's response, Martha's A vehicle arrived behind the SUVs she wore stylishly when she went out. A blazer, and her presence is just as authoritative as Arthur follows her, were two veterans from the area she had contacted in males who had spent years with Mildred and didn't intend to leave her alone. Martha looked around the area, feeling degraded. Her piercing gaze falls on you, the leader. Choose to meddle with the wrong woman, she, coolly, do you know who she is what she did, serving this country when those who are similar to you would not. Even if you move a finger, you believe you're tiny. You're nothing but an intimidator with antics. The leader opened his mouth to make a noise, dispute, but Arthur interrupted him with Arthur, who was sufficiently adroit, pointed to the motorcyclist. Get aboard a motorcycle and have it pick up. You're rubbish. If you're wise, get off your bikes and go. You will reconsider returning, here or disturbing others in this manner. Once more, nobody moved for a brief moment. The leader grudgingly gestured to his crew. They started collecting the, rubbish. Arthur and their swagger are totally gone. His group didn't need to increase their voices, or deliver a single blow to their just being there had been sufficient, as the motorcyclists mounted their motorbikes and were ready to depart from Arthur. Looked over to Mildred and gave her a little. She nodded in return, her smile growing. Justice had been served to some extent, but for the lesson, Mildred wasn't only about. It was about getting her tranquility back, instructing the motorcyclists on something they'd never forget, that the motorcycle riders grudgingly roared low as they rode off their motors. Defeat. The street at last went back to the serene silence that it once had, familiar with the neighbors who had been urinating from their windows, and behind broken doors started to step outside. They gathered warily and slowly, whispering in low tones close to Mildred's residence, their gaze flitting between her and their voices. As the contingent of veterans that had arrived in support of her, Mildred continued to sit on her porch. Her hands were folded neatly on her lap. Her face was composed, although Arthur, unwavering, ascended the stairs to take the vacant chair next to her and join her. His presence was as constant as she felt warm, because she was protective. She hadn't felt comfortable. For a brief while, neither of them spoke for years. Allowing the silence to descend like a blanket, Martha came over the neighborhood. Her shoes made a gentle clicking sound against the sidewalk. They're not coming back, she remarked. Forceful, yet gentle tone. And if they do, they will discover what true trouble looks like. The sound was like Mildred laughing quietly, mild yet significant. I wasn't overly concerned, she answered. I knew you'd come. Arthur sat back in his chair, and looking at the little group of neighbors congregated at the perimeter of. It appears that you have some, he continued, teasingly. I'll explain what to do. Mildred grinned at his voice, but she didn't. Moved to speak to them rather than one of the A-woman in her 50s who lives next door, is named Denise, took a step forward. With hesitation, Miss Washington started her voice with a hint of wonder and regret. We were unaware of your service regarding we ought to have done everything you did. Voiced earlier. But Mildred raised a softly, silencing her with a hand. No, she said in a voice that she needed to apologize. Stable. We all derive our power from various ways that today just so happened to be. My Denise turned and nodded her eyes. The neighbors' glistening started to disseminate with silent gratitude and warm. There were lingering smiles as they went by. Longer, putting their hands over Mildred's as though to express gratitude. They were unable to fully Arthur's words as the street drained, once again turned his face toward Mildred. You knew you didn't have to soften deal with this on your own. You could have called earlier. Mildred gave him a dim look. Sparkle in her eye and prevent you from participating in the Where's the Joy hero? That Arthur made a hearty, sincere laugh. That persisted until the evening. He answered, you haven't changed at all. Mildred's eyes were as unyielding as ever. Looked at the younger motorcyclist who had hesitated before noticing him. staying on the periphery of the group, his conflicted look as he observed the others retrieve their mess now, as the other motorcyclists rode. He remained behind, pacing uneasily. Prior to ultimately reaching the porch, I wanted to mention that he started his speech trailing off. He thrust his hands inside. He avoided looking at his jacket pockets. I didn't intend for things to become that dire. Mildred, I had no idea who you were. Examined him briefly before speaking. It's not about my identity, she said. It's about how you treat people, spoken kindly. Young individuals, regardless of their identity. The man nodded while his shoulders slumped beneath the burden of her. I'll do better, he muttered earlier. He rode off, walking back to his bike. Mildred reclined in her chair. Arthur exhaled slowly and went over and gave her a pat. You've always had a talent for words, hand. Mildred shrugged and grinned a little, teasing her lips. Sometimes all someone needs is a reminder, but they're not always. Some nice people have a force that trembles the floor underneath you and guarantees that you will always remember the sun fell behind the horizon. Using orange hues to paint the street with gold, Mildred gave herself permission to pause, to imagine that her peaceful house was once more hers. Tranquility was restored, without using violence, but with unwavering determination and her strength. Relationships between Arthur, Martha, and the others had intervened when she most needed them, not because of her lack of power, but rather because they recognized the significance of Arthur remained standing together for a time. More time spent sitting next to her in friendly quiet, he remarked. At last, releasing the silence, it wasn't just about you out there. Today, those lads were taught a lesson that's simply about deference, but also about bravery, and where the real deal is. Mildred nodded slowly, saying that loudness isn't about who yells the loudest, or creates the most dramatic situation concerning remaining steadfast when others attempt to tremble. You need to know when to take action, and when to allow silence to speak. For itself, Arthur himself grinned, and you've been imparting that knowledge throughout your life as during the night. The neighbors who had previously assembled started going back to their houses while bringing a growing admiration for the quiet woman on some flowers were left at the edge of the corner of her fence as a token of appreciation. Others merely gestured, with their faces full of appreciation for the young biker's remarks remained in Mildred's thoughts. I'll do. She believed he would do better because it was a reminder that even people who appear to hardened can alter when exposed to the opportunities. But change is necessary. Responsibility. And she had ensured that they realized that Martha took the lead in. Her pointed heels clicked softly on the porch. In opposition to the wooden stairs, I understand, Mildred. She smiled. Would prefer not to be associated with. You'd think after you laughed, Mildred, people would have known better after all these years. Rather than tampering with the veterans, the trio had a peaceful chuckle before Martha and Arthur bid her farewell. Good night, when their SUVs vanished. Mildred remained on the street down a bit longer on the porch to allow the cool. She gazed up as the night air enveloped her, thinking of her husband while gazing up at the skies, companions, and the life she had created. Each struggle, each obstacle had brought her here to this earned moment of peace and treasured prior to entering. She looked at the tiny group of people who are still. If there's one thing to take, neighbors. Despite everything, her voice possessing a silent strength that allows it to stand. Don't wait for someone else to do it alone. Sometimes having courage means becoming the initially too. The words hung in the air as they were spoken, reminding everyone who is listening that size and power don't equate to strength. It originates from unity and conviction. Mildred's door closed behind her. The house was once again peaceful, yet the effects of the events that week would remain in people's hearts. Each and every person who saw it. If you liked this story, please remember to share it. Your opinions in the space provided here. For more, please subscribe to our channel. Tales of bravery, tenacity, and the community's power.